Hey friend, Graham here from recordingrevolution.com. And today I want to unpack how I recorded a song on my iPhone in response to last week's video. So if you caught last week's video, I did an entire song start to finish using nothing more than my iPhone 8. Recorded it all inside using virtual instruments, mic'd up my vocals and guitar amp and percussion, all with the built-in microphone on the iPhone, mixed it all in Garageband, and just sort of put that video together so you could see and hear what's possible. And the response has been overwhelming, and it has done exactly what I intended it to do, which is to motivate you to get out there and go make a record using whatever you have. The whole point of that video was to show you that it's game over. This is the best time to be a music maker in the history of the universe because you have no more excuses. Whether you have home studio equipment or just the phone in your pocket, you can make a great sounding recording and share it with the world. So I'm so grateful that it seemed to have done that. The comments have been overwhelming that you have been like, yes, I'm gonna go do this. If Graham can do this on an iPhone, surely I can do this with my home studio equipment. And that's the point. Now, I got a lot of other questions though that related to how, like, can you show me a little bit more of how you did it? Like, how did you mic it up? I tried to show all of that in the camera angles in the video, but people had more questions about how I mic'd it up. And then also, what was I doing in GarageBand, in the software, to get it to sound the way it sounded? And there's also some speculation from a few people that like, Graham, didn't you just pull this out of GarageBand and mix it in Pro Tools or something like that? Or did you have it mastered? And the answer is no. Everything you heard in that video is literally the GarageBand project on my phone, did it all on my phone. I mixed it like in 30 minutes. It really wasn't even that complex of a mix. A little bit of balancing, a little bit of EQ, compression, and effects, which I'll show you. And then I just exported it right out of the software and synced that up to the footage inside of the video. So that's literally all done in the phone, no mastering, nothing. And in fact, a lot of people requested it. I've gone ahead and shared the song and put it up on all my major platforms, on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, the works. It's called Wandering Man, iPhone edition. It's a song I've done previously in a studio, but this is the iPhone edition, so you can download the actual song or stream it wherever you like to stream music and hear it on your own system. It's exactly, literally the export out of my phone. Now let's break down a few of the basic challenges I faced with making a record on the iPhone. We'll begin with the easy stuff, the virtual instruments, the drums, the piano, the bass were very easy. I just had to learn those tools, but getting sounds was easy. I didn't really spend a ton of time even listening to every sound possible because that's just not my style. I like to move quickly. And I was able to get a good drum sound, sync it up, good piano sound, bass guitar sound. And what's beautiful about GarageBand is if you're slightly off with your timing, just like a lot of pieces of software, there's a quantize feature so you can sort of lock it in a little bit. So if I'm a little sloppy on the piano, you can lock it in a little bit to the 8th note or the 16th note. So that's about all I did with those virtual instruments for drums, piano, and bass. When it came to the guitars, I used a tiny little practice amp, a Bugera V5, which I've had for years. It's a tiny little tube amp. I just used it because it's a real low cost, kind of accessible home studio guitar amp that a lot of people have. What I noticed about this internal microphone was that it overloaded really quickly. So when I had originally had it right up near the grill of the guitar amp, like I would if I put a Shure SM57 or a microphone right up there, it overloaded way too quickly. So without me even understanding why, because I don't really get what's going on inside the GarageBand software, I just moved the phone back about a foot, and then I took a guitar pedal that I had, turned it upside down, and made like a ramp so I could angle my phone so that the bottom of the phone, where the microphone is kind of angled up from the floor, pointing at the amp. I played, basically left it there because that's where it wasn't really overloading the microphone too much. It did overload on some of the distorted parts, and I just played. That was pretty much my go-to guitar amp positioning. All that I changed with the guitar amps, I had the clean sound on that amp. Then I cranked up the gain and changed the tone on it to create a distorted sound for one of the overdriven guitars on the left, I think you hear in the mix during the hook. And then I played another pass where I plugged my guitar through my Sans amp, distortion pedal, and then ran that into the guitar amp as well, which you're not really supposed to use the Sans amp and an amp, but I did because that's all I could do. to give it a little bit more of a distorted sound that was slightly different tone than the guitar on the left. So in the hook, when the distorted guitars come in, it's the same amp, same positioning with the microphone or the phone itself, just a different tone. Percussion was the same way. It's super loud, that tambourine. So I just put the phone down on the arm of one of my chairs in my studio, and I stood back to the point where I wasn't overloading the mic too much. I still think it was clipping from what I could see, but in the mix, it sounded fine. Again, I didn't spend a lot of time like making this the perfect mic placement. I just made sure the level was okay. And then when listening back to the tone alongside the drums, piano, and bass, I wanted to make sure it worked. Now, recording the vocals was the hardest part. The microphone inside the iPhone, I think I mentioned this in the original video, is more omnidirectional. It like picks up everything all around. It's not super focused, or it's like not like a cardioid microphone that you'd have that's kind of just picking up what's in front of it. It kind of picks up everything in my room, and it's picking up a constant hiss. The air's not even on when I'm recording, but it's still picking up hiss. It's picking up outside noise. It was super noisy, and I got really nervous. So that was challenge number one, was how noisy it was. Challenge number two was the lack of pop filter, because I was overloading the microphone. Originally, when I was singing into it, I had it real close to my face, but any P's or B's you could hear when I listened back, it would have that plosive where it would just distort for a second. It sounded really, really amateur. And so what I tried to do was move the phone about 4 inches, 3-4 inches away from my voice, my mouth, and sing across it. Like, so I'm not blowing air directly into it. I'm blowing air to the side of it and moving it back that much. And you can see in the video where I'm holding it. Moving it to that position literally cleaned up all that excessive low end and air. It really, really made a difference and gave me something more usable in the recording. And that was it for the doubles that I recorded. I re-recorded the chorus on top of myself, so I'm doubling myself in the chorus so the vocals sound thicker. And then also the harmonies and the extra vocals, little call and response vocals, those were all just mic'd up the exact same way, just holding the phone right over here and recording them on different tracks. Now, a lot of the sound came together in the mixing phase, which I did really quickly inside of Garageband. So let me just show you and walk you through my settings on those tracks. Drums sounded great, but I decided to use a little bit of compression just to give them a little bit more smack. And I just started messing around with the threshold and the gain and the attack until I could hear it snapping a little bit more. I wish there was a VU meter on this compressor. There's not, so I don't have any visual readout of how much gain reduction. I don't even know what the gain reduction is, but you do have a mix knob, which is cool. So you could really do some heavy compression and then dial the mix slider down and do some parallel compression if you wanted to inside of GarageBand, but I didn't need it. The drum sample sounded great. So a little bit of compression, and then just a little bit on the EQ, a little top end. You can see I just boosted just a little bit from like 5K up, just to get a little more air on the drums and the cymbals. The piano, a little bit of compression, but then here the biggest thing was EQ. And the piano track was actually 2 different tracks. If you saw in the video, I could only play one part at a time because I only had like 14 keys. I couldn't play the low end bass notes and the moving parts at the same time. So I had to layer them one at a time. And I'm so bad at GarageBand, I didn't really know how to layer my performance on top of the original track. I wasn't doing it the way I wanted it to. So I just made them 2 separate piano tracks. One was the 2-finger moving part, and the other track was just literally the bass note. So on the main moving part, there's an EQ for that where I've got a boost in the mid-range around 1K, and then actually took off some top end. And this was to sort of make it a little more vibey, a little more muffled in the top end. I didn't want it to be super crisp and studio-esque. I wanted it to be a little more vibey. And then I needed it to cut through a little bit better in the mix. So that's that 1K boost there. The low-end bass guitar, or excuse me, bass keyboard part, you can see I've done a slight low-end boost around 200 on the EQ, just to thicken it up a little bit more since it's holding down a lot of that weight at the bottom. Bass guitar had a little bit of compression, but again, most of this mix is the EQ. Take a look at the EQ curve. I've got a boost in the low end, below 100 to fatten it up a little bit more. On bass, I usually like to scoop out a lot of the low mids to clean up bass. So I scooped out around 300, like a big chunk down, and that cleaned it up a little bit more so you could hear more of the top end and the low end. The clean guitar, this is the main picking guitar. I sort of took off some of the top end and did a little boost around 700 hertz to give it a little bit of a mid-range spot. So again, you're starting to see each instrument has its own spot. The piano sort of lived in the 1K range. This guitar lived in the sort of 600 to 700 range. And I took out some top end because this didn't need to be the most bright, most forward thing. I wanted to leave that for the cymbals and the drums and the vocals. The two guitars and the hook, the distorted guitars on the left and the right, I tried to thicken those up. You can see on the left one, I've got a low end boost, a mid-range cut, and a top end cut. I just really wanted it to be rounder and less present. And then on the other guitar on the right, I did not as thick of a low end boost, but I did a mid-range boost, a low mid around like 400 hertz to give that its own space. And I took off a lot of top end there. It was really fizzy. That was the Sans amp. It was a little too fizzy in the mix. So I really tried to tone it down, mute it a little bit. So you notice the guitars, they come in and thicken it up a little bit without being too aggressive and too harsh. Plus they're just sort of filling in the gaps again. Here's the EQ curve for my little lead guitar part in verse 2. I just try to thin it out a little bit and then give it a little bit more oomph. You can see a little bit of a mid-range bump and a top end bump. It just wasn't really sticking out in the mix. It was getting lost. So I was just fiddling around with the EQ in context with everything else to make sure that that little lead guitar part sat in there with the vocals and the piano and everything else. And just for context, all these EQ moves are being done while listening to the entire mix. I never soloed a single track to then tweak the EQ, and I would recommend you never do that. Soloing and EQing is one of the dumbest things you can do because generally speaking, 99 times out of 100, it's irrelevant what that track sounds like in solo because no one will ever hear it in solo. What matters is that they hear it in context with the mix. So I try to listen to that guitar part while everything else is going on and say, can I hear it? If not, why not? Is it a volume thing? Is it an EQ thing? Is it a tone thing? And it's usually a combination of the three. All right, let's talk about vocals and then we'll talk about effects and wrap this up. The vocals were really noisy, like I said at the beginning. Really, really noisy. So thank goodness GarageBand has a noise gate. So the first effect I used was the noise gate. It's a simple dial. You just grab the threshold up or down till it's starting to cut out the noise that you don't want and leave in the singing that you do want. So I did solo the lead vocal here to make sure that I'm setting the noise gate threshold at the correct spot. Otherwise, I'd be cutting off the beginning and the end of words. I needed to make sure that it was only cutting out stuff. So you would hear me sing, and then the moment I would stop singing, it would completely mute my vocal. Very, very important. It sounds unnatural in solo, but in the mix, you never know, and it keeps the vocal a lot cleaner in between phrases. Next up was the compressor. And this was really important on the lead vocal to get it to sound more radio ready, to get it sound more pop, more upfront, because vocals are so dynamic. They're all over the place. You need it really to be compressed to sound upfront every single word. So I just played with the compressor, messed around with the threshold, and then the makeup gain till I could hear the vocal energy coming out. If I pushed it too much and it got real flat and lifeless, then I would back it off. Again, I wish I had some visual readouts, but there was enough to just at least control the attack and the ratio and the threshold, and I could hear the difference it was making. So compression was huge to getting this vocal to pump nicely and to cut through the mix, really. EQ was critical on the vocal. There's a lot of low-end rumble. Again, it was picking up like the sound of trucks, like streets over rumbling. That's how sensitive this little microphone was and not directional. So again, it's very noisy. So the noise gate's helping, but when I'm singing, noise gate's open, so you hear all the mess. So I'm using EQ here. You can see I've got our low cut where I've rolled off everything below 200. So it's sloping it all off, cleaning up the low end. And then I dipped out a little bit around 4K that I thought sounded a little harsh in the vocal. I just got rid of some of that. And then actually a little bit of the top end is like a little too crispy. This mic was super bright, super crispy. So as I compressed it, I started to get more of the crispiness that I didn't want. So I took out some of that crispiness and some of the low end. So I think on the vocal here, it's all EQ cuts, no boosts, just all cuts. And that's really important if you're in a room or with a microphone that's noisy to focus on subtractive EQ, meaning you're cutting what you don't want to then leave what is good as opposed to just boosting all the time. And this was all I did on the lead vocal with some cuts. Now let's talk about effects because that's what a lot of people are asking about, the delay and reverb effect. Now inside of GarageBand, I learned this the hard way. You only have 2 effects and they're master effects. So you get 1 delay and 1 reverb, and you can choose what those sounds are, but they are the only 2 you have to use on every track. So you can't put an individual delay on the vocal and have 1 sound of delay there and 1 sound on the guitars. It's 1 delay sound, and you can send as much of the tracks as you want to that delay sound. Totally fine. I just didn't realize that. I thought each track had its own delay, so I kept changing delay sounds, but all I was doing was changing the global delay sound. But under Master Effects, they call it echo, which is really delay, and reverb. So I didn't use reverb as much as I thought I would. I might have played around with it, but I ended up just leaving it and just focusing on the echo, which is the delay. And under the Master Effects, you get a bunch of choices. You get a quarter note echo, a dark quarter note echo, which is nice. I liked that on a lot of things. It's like roll off the top end. But what I ended up using was the triplet. I liked the dark quarter note echo, the ambient delay, and the triplet. But when I had to pick just one for the whole song for everything, the triplet sounded best on the vocals. So I did whatever the vocals needed. I catered to the vocals. And you don't have any control over these settings. You just choose the preset. Looks like there's 10 or so presets. You choose the delay or the echo preset, and then all you can choose from there is how much of it do you hear, which is really like a sending to the echo or the delay plugin. So it's pretty basic, but this triplet echo sounded what I wanted to hear in my head. And so I just picked that effect, dialed it up a little bit here on the vocals, and went to town. The double vocal and the hook, very similar settings to the main vocal. Other vocal sounds were more affected, the little echoes and calls and response later on in the hook and the bridge at the end. And I want you to see what I was doing there because a lot of people asked about how did I get those effects. And that's all EQ. That's all filtering, which is what an EQ is. You're filtering out frequencies or focusing on frequencies. So for some of the call and response ones, you can see I've got a much higher high pass. So I'm rolling off even more of the low end, which makes it sound thinner. And then I'm boosting a mid-range frequency. In this case, I'm boosting around 1.3K. So I'm thinning it out, boosting a mid-range frequency. That really makes it sound super thin. Here's another call and response in the hook. Very similar thing. I'm just scooping out a ton of low end, boosting the mid-range, and in this case, actually then cutting out top end, a lot of it. It took out a lot of top end to make it duller. So this is a great technique for you if you're mixing vocals. You have your lead vocal, make it sound nice and clear and up front through compression and EQ. And then some of the background vocals or the call and response vocals, if you want them to sound far away and affected, which is what I wanted for this song, then roll off low end, but also roll off top end. When you make something a little more dull, like removing some of the high end and the clarity, it makes it sound farther away, more distant. So that's what all I'm doing. I'm doing that all with just EQ. It's EQ is making the biggest difference here. It's making it sound affected and far away, but then you'll also see that I'm using the echo and reverb on these affected background tracks. And I'm using more echo than the lead vocal, and I'm using reverb, which I didn't use on the lead vocal, all of which creates more ambience, so it sounds like it's a thinner, farther away, more distant, more affected vocal that sounds really, really cool and vibey. So that's all just by driving up the echo knob and the reverb knob, and again, everything is going through that triplet echo. It's the same effect on everything that's using the delay. All of that again, took me about 30 minutes. Most of what I was doing is while I was layering tracks, I was kind of blending the volume so that what I heard in my headphones was like inspiring to me and sort of feeling like the song. So when it came time to mix, it was pretty much leveled the way I wanted. I just sort of panned some of the hard guitars, like the distorted guitars, hard left and right. I panned the piano and the bass kind of up the middle. I focused on some of the lead guitar parts that come in and out to have them panned off a little bit. But I wanted like the verses to be kind of narrow and the chorus to be wide. And then when the little call and response vocals came in, I just wanted them panned at different places. So if I needed a vocal to be panned different places, I would open up another track to have one pan this way and one pan the other way because I didn't know how to do automation in GarageBand on the phone. I don't even know if you can do GarageBand automation. Probably can. I didn't know how, so I just made another track. But as you saw, most of what made the mix work was EQ. That was my biggest tool, and that's what I spent most of the time doing, was making sure every track had its own space sonically, because they worked well together, but it's like making sure the vocal has got its own space and the bass is down here and the guitars are not too bright to compete with the vocal, but not too muffled that you don't feel them in the energy. And a simple EQ, thank goodness GarageBand has a visual EQ, because it was a lot easier to sort of see what I was doing and get a feel for what I'm boosting and cutting. And it really, really made a huge difference. And then the echo and the reverbs were just a nice thing to put that little spin on it and put that little effect and make it more creative and interesting. And beyond that, I left everything as is, exported it out. There was no mastering. There's no master effects on this version of GarageBand that I know of that I could just put on the whole mix. So it just is what it is, rendered it out, and that's it. So two things. If you haven't already watched the iPhone video, go watch it and enjoy it and get a sense for what these tracks sound like. But then two, I want to give you something that might help you. We've been talking about EQ a lot in this video, and I know that EQ is something that we all understand, lows, mids, highs, but I don't think people realize that EQ is like 80% of making a great mix. I spend most of my time in EQ. It is what gives everything space, clarity, dimension. It's so powerful. And if you get EQ right, it's a great mix. If you get EQ wrong, it's muddy or harsh, or it's hard to hear everything. EQ is super important. And as you could tell, that's what I spent most of my time doing in GarageBand, and the tool I use the most to get the mix to sound the way it sounds. So what I've done to make EQ simpler for you is I put together an EQ checklist. It's literally step 1 through 7 of how to think about EQ, how to use EQ strategically, some best practices and tips, and also some of the biggest EQ mistakes I see being made in home studios, because you gotta be very strategic in the home studio environment when using EQ. So the most common techniques for EQ, the what, the how, the why of EQ, I put it all together into my EQ checklist. It's literally a simple 2-page PDF that you can print up and put on your desk when you mix, or if you wanna have it new school, have it on your phone or your iPad. And that way, when you are mixing, whether you're doing something crazy like me and mixing in GarageBand on your iPhone, or you're mixing on your computer or whatever, when it comes time to EQ, you can reference all my best techniques and approaches and steps to understanding EQ, so you won't get lost and you'll actually get the most out of your mix. It's so important to EQ well. It's what made the vocals clear up, come together, and sit beautifully in this mix. It's huge. So to download it, it's absolutely free. Just go to eqchecklist.com. Put the link here in the video and in the description for you. eqchecklist.com. You should download this and just reference it all the time. Just use it as one of your little tools, one of your little mini resources, so that whenever you mix, no matter what kind of music you mix, no matter what software you mix on, even if you're mixing live sound, this EQ checklist will help you. Again, it's my 7-step checklist for getting the EQ to do what you want it to do to make your mix sound as good as possible. Couldn't be easier, and it's my free gift to you. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the videos. Have a great music making week, and I'll see you on another video real soon.